What I'm discussing here is the difference between games about the results of using a build system, making a build, and on the other hand, games about very often using a build system, very often making different builds. I know that sounds like a subtle difference, but I bet I can convince you that it maybe isn't. Focusing on that more has helped me have a lot more fun playing both of these sorts of games. So, by the way, welcome aboard, folks. I'm Zandy. I'll show you what I mean. So first, consider games where you start by making a build. The beginning of the game is you creating a character, and then that character defines your experience of the game. Basically, you play that character through a story campaign or some such, and the game reacts to the stats or skills that you chose in various ways. There's no question you did make a build. It's just that in plenty of games like that, you don't necessarily make any other builds. The very first thing you do is make a build, but then there's very little of that in the rest of the game. Some role-playing games are like that. You've also got cases where you do start by making a build, character creation like that previous example, but where some other system involves retooling your build as you play. So in Baldur's Gate 3, for example, even if you don't respec, we'll get right back to that, you get new and better gear as you go. And that will mean setting up your equipment differently from time to time. Even without any respecking, you might end up having a pretty build-making focused experience that way. And of course, you can often respec in these sorts of games, so you could make a ton of builds if you wanted to. One of my playthroughs of Baldur's Gate 3, my friend and I respec'd almost every single time we sat down to play. So I redid most of the character creation at least 10 times, maybe, and I don't even consider that a lot. You should see what my solo playthrough was like. But the thing is, that isn't part of the core gameplay loop, or the primary gameplay loop. The game isn't designed around that. It's just fine if you do it. You know, it's cheap to respec in Baldur's Gate 3, and in some ways that makes it a better example here. It's not much gold to respec in this specific game. You can do it a lot if you want to. But the game is built assuming you have the option, yet you may or may not use it that much. It's certainly not built assuming you respec 10 times. So you're starting to see what I mean. Maybe it's just me, but some of the first games I've tended to think of over the years, when I think about making builds, are these role-playing type of things, when they really don't have making builds very, if you'll forgive me, built in. Yeah, I'm sorry. I noticed this in the first place simply because as I grew to enjoy making builds more and more, I noticed that the games I originally thought of as places to make builds in didn't actually focus on me making builds at all. I hope it's clear, by the way, I'm not saying that's bad in any way, just that there's a big difference between games that revolve around your build and games that revolve around you making builds. Okay, so some of you are then asking, what does it mean for a game to be built assuming you do respec then? You know, what's the alternative? Well, to make a game assuming the player respecs without forcing them to seems a little challenging to me. The examples I thought of do force you to make new builds from time to time. Just, it may vary how forcefully the game does that, or how much you need to make a truly new build versus just kind of switch it up, you know, swap some new pieces or characters in. Genshin Impact, especially in Spiral Abyss, the kind of challenge dungeon in Genshin Impact, there are various enemies that are immune or resistant to one or another damage type. You may want to make sure your damage output isn't mostly that type, but that's not very forceful, I'd argue, and not forcing you to change it up that often. If your team is 2 or 3 of the 7 elements, you won't need to change anything unless enemies are those 2 or 3 elements. But you see the example, making different builds is here a little bit a part of the core gameplay loop, at least some of the time. The game has the design to make that pressure apply if it wants to. And with that example, maybe you've thought of a rather large category of games that are more or less a fit here. Arcade-style, semi-randomized, upgrades as you go, reset when you die kind of games, more or less roguelikes. Your run involves making a build as you go, and that resets when you die, requiring you to make a new one. It may not be very different from previous builds, depending on how the upgrades in the game are designed, but on the other hand, it's fairly common to attempt to make the same sort of build you had last run, and simply fail to do so in many of these games. I would say this is a core gameplay loop about making builds, at least potentially. It's also true that plenty of roguelikes lean away from that feeling and just go for more powerful upgrades as you go, rather than specific interactions between your upgrades. They may interact, but often these games will have your upgrades synergize more generally, like almost everything is a multiplier for almost everything else. But anyway, there you have it. I'm sure there will be plenty of other examples of both of these types of build experiences in the comments if you want them. I argue that games about your build and games about making builds are often found among surprisingly different, almost opposite types of game design. Now, you've come along for the ride with me in this video, thanks for that. Why are we here? Why might thinking about all of this be useful? Well, there's the matter of build systems being kind of hard to find. A lot of games where you won't spend much of your time making builds begin with the one big time you do make a build, or the time you make by far the most of your build. And conversely, a lot of arcadey experiences are almost all build making, but just not all at once, or it doesn't look like that at first. If you compare starting one of these games versus starting maybe a role-playing experience, the role-playing experience, you'll have made a build at hour 1, but at hour 50, you'll have made way more builds in this kind of game instead. Indeed, I think I previously thought of role-playing games as the primary source of build systems because those are some of the only games where you can see that there will be a build system early on. They're more obvious, in other words. But if you like making builds, you may be well served by somewhat unintuitive games you wouldn't at first think you'd enjoy. What exactly is the way to know that these games will contain the build making that you will enjoy? I wish I had a better answer for you for that. And if you like games that begin with something like character creation, but then go on to focus pretty heavily on that one singular build, it may be that you enjoy the results of builds, distinct gameplay experiences, more than specifically making new builds, and that might help you find games you'd enjoy more. You know, I usually really enjoy making builds, but there's nothing worse than a build system that gets in the way when you want to enjoy some other aspect of a game, but you just have to make a build when you're not interested in making one. I mean, I think this is a big weakness of making builds as a genre or secondary gameplay loop or whatever you want to call it. Build systems and games focused on them are kind of hard to spot, and what they even are is pretty subjective. That first point is, find more specific games. This subtle distinction can help with that. Okay, but the big takeaway for me is that the activity of playing a game about your build and the activity of playing a game about making builds, those two can be surprisingly different activities. Again, in these Arknights examples, the focus when a game is about making builds is often on the challenge from the game, and you make a build, which is your toolbox to tackle that challenge. Often the activity is about you understanding and deconstructing what the game has put in front of you with your arsenal of builds or build ideas. Or if you make your own really specific combo-y build, you're often fighting the game to try to execute the combo, almost like the experience of a friendly competition. Whereas games about that one build you made, you might say these are self-centered by comparison. You make what you want for you, and then the game revolves around that. But first of all, it's your entertainment time. I think it's great if you want your game to be about you. That's a modest but often very fun use of a build system. I'd suggest that those games can be pretty involved experiences in practice. Your build is more about you considering what type of experience you want to have, kind of game designery. And in the first place, I like to think of build systems as parts of games that allow you, the player, to do the last little bit of game design to get a personalized experience, or which allow you, the game designer, to ask your players to fill in the blank about that last little bit. So in that model, games about making builds may give you a lot of little blanks to fill in, but perhaps only after you've seen what's coming, blanks with a lot of context, I guess. Whereas games about your one build you made may ask you to write a sort of opening paragraph for the game you're going to play. You make your build at the start, that's what I mean. You could say those games are providing bigger blanks, but just less often, perhaps as you level up or again at the beginning of the game. I personally enjoy both, but my point is that I definitely don't like them for the same reasons, and I can think of plenty of sorts of games that sound much more different, but which are much more similar experiences in practice. I guess that's the thing overall, isn't it? Build systems offer some of gaming's most specific gameplay experiences. These games are often letting you create and play something pretty particular, and so I think it's worth considering, even more than for other types of games, what you want from them. It'll make it way easier to find and get what you want. Folks, I've been Zandy, thanks for joining me. Get out there and fill in some blanks. And if you'd like to stay aboard, where are we off to next?